Daf Yomi Tractate, above Metzia 61a, top of the page, with the words Im Eino Inyan. If the verse is not referring to the matter of neshech with money, as it is already stated in the same verse, you shall not lend with interest to your brother, indicating that taking money as interest is prohibited. Apply the expression neshech of money to the matter of ribis. In other words, tarbit, with money, tarbis, with money. The Brisa continues, I have derived a source for this prohibition only with regard to a borrower. For whom is it prohibited to pay interest on a loan from where it is derived, that there is also prohibition stated with regard to a lender? The Brisa answers, neshech is stated with regard to a borrower, and neshech is stated with regard to a lender. Just as concerning neshech, that is stated with regard to a borrower, you did not distinguish with regard to it between a loan of money and a loan of food, or between whether the interest is forbidden as neshech or as ribis. So too concerning neshech, stated with regard to a lender, do not distinguish with regard to it between a loan of money and a loan of food, or between whether the interest is forbidden as neshech or as ribis. The Brisa concludes, from where is it derived to include in the prohibition interest of any sort? The verse states, neshech of anything that is lent with interest. Ravina said, an explicit verse is not required neither to derive neshech of food nor to derive ribis of money, as if it were written, you shall not give him your money with neshech and your food with marbit, juxtaposing neshech with money alone and marbit with food alone, it would be, as you say, that there is a need for the derivation of the Brisa. But now that it is written, you shall not give him your money with neshech, and with marbit you shall not give him your food, interposing both neshech and marbit between money and food, read into the verse this interpretation. Your money you shall not give him for neshech and for marbit, and for neshech and for marbit you shall not give your food. The Gemara asks, but isn't the Tana of the Brisa saying that neshech of food and tarbit of money are derived by means of a verbal analogy? Neshech is stated with regard to a borrower, and neshech is also stated with regard to a lender. How can Ravina and Amora state that the verbal analogy is not needed? The Gemara answers, this is what Ravina is saying. Had the verse not stated the terms neshech and tarbit interposed between money and food, I would have said that the halacha that both terms apply to both money and food would be derived by means of a verbal analogy. Now, as the verse is stated in that manner, a verbal analogy is not necessary. The Gemara asks, rather, why do I need this verbal analogy? The Gemara explains, I need the verbal analogy to teach that neshech of anything that is lent for interest. Deuteronomy 23:20, which is written with regard to a borrower, but not written with regard to a lender, applies to a lender as well. Rava said, why do I need it to be that the merciful one state writes a prohibition with regard to interest, a prohibition with regard to robbery, see Leviticus 19:13, and a prohibition with regard to exploitation, see Leviticus 25:14. A transaction where one of the parties overcharged or underpaid. There appears to be one principle underlying all three prohibitions. One must not take possession of another's money in illegitimate ways. The Gemara explains they are necessary, as had the merciful one written the prohibition only with regard to interest, one could not have derived the other prohibitions from it, because it is a prohibition with a novel element that does not appear in other halachot. This novel element is that the merciful one prohibited alone with interest, even for the borrower. With regard to the two other prohibitions, there is a prohibition against taking another's money, but there is no prohibition for the victim who has his money taken. And had the merciful one written the prohibition only with regard to robbery, one could not have derived the other prohibitions from it, as perhaps robbery is prohibited only due to the fact that it is an action taken against the will of the victim. But in the cases of exploitation and interest, where there is an element of consent, one would say they are not prohibited. And had the merciful one written the prohibition only with regard to exploitation, one could not have derived the other prohibitions from it, as perhaps exploitation is prohibited only due to the fact that the victim does not know that he was a victim of exploitation and therefore cannot waive repayment. In the cases of interest and robbery, the borrower and the victim, respectively, are aware that their money was taken and waiving repayment is possible. So perhaps those actions are not prohibited. Perhaps those actions are not prohibited. The Gemara suggests, although no one of these prohibitions, although no one of these prohibitions can be derived from one of the other prohibitions, perhaps one of them can be derived from the other two. The Gemara clarifies, which prohibition will you derive from the other two? Let the merciful one not write the prohibition with regard to interest, and instead derive that prohibition from these two, robbery and exploitation. The Gemara rejects that suggestion. What is notable about these prohibitions? They are notable in that they are transgressed without the consent of the victim. Will you say the same with regard to interest, which the borrower gives with his consent, as he agrees to accept the loan under those conditions? The Gemara suggests, let the merciful one not write the prohibition with regard to exploitation, and instead derive the prohibition from these two, robbery and interest. The Gemara rejects that suggestion. What is notable about these prohibitions? They are notable in that they are not transgressed in the typical manner of buying and selling. Will you say the same with regard to exploitation, which is transgressed in the context of typical buying and selling? Rather, let the merciful one not write the prohibition with regard to robbery, and instead derive that prohibition from these two, interest and exploitation. As what refutation will you offer? If you say what is notable about interest, it is notable in that the prohibition of interest contains a novel element. The case of exploitation will prove that a novel element is not a factor, as the prohibition against exploitation contains no novel element. If you say what is notable about exploitation, it is notable in that this case the victim does not know that he was a victim of exploitation and therefore he cannot waive repayment. The case of interest will prove that the inability to waive repayment is not a factor, as the borrower is aware of the interest and able to waive repayment. The Gemara comments, and the inference has reverted to its starting point. V'chazar hadin. The aspect of this case, interest, is not like the aspect of that case, exploitation. And the aspect of that case, exploitation, is not like the aspect of this case, interest. Their common denominator is that one robs another of money, takes money from another, does not do to. I will also bring the prohibition against robbery, which shares that common denominator, and derive it from the other two prohibitions. The sages said, indeed, the prohibition against robbery is superfluous. But if the prohibition against robbery can be derived from the prohibitions against interest and exploitation. Why do I need the prohibition written in the Torah with regard to robbery? The Gemara answers, that verse is not written to prohibit a standard case of robbery. Rather, it serves to prohibit the action of one who withholds the wages of a hired laborer. In that case, unlike robbery, the employer does not take money from the laborer. He merely fails to pay him his wages. The Gemara challenges, with regard to one who withholds the wages of a hired laborer, it is explicitly written, you shall not oppress a hired laborer who is poor and destitute. Deuteronomy 24:14. There is no need to derive this prohibition from the verse concerning robbery. The Gemara answers, it is written so that withholding the wages of a hired laborer always involves violating two prohibitions. The Gemara asks, well, let us interpret the verse concerning robbery as prohibiting interest or exploitation and say that it is written so that these prohibitions always involve violating two prohibitions. The Gemara answers, the prohibition against robbery is applied to the case of withholding the wages of a hired laborer because it is a matter derived from its context.